Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary LeClue. I'm the director of the MSW program. And I am going to just, so welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn. Today, Phillip West, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, is going to be talking about military sexual trauma. I am just going to first go over a couple of business things before we get started, and then I'll introduce our speaker and hand it over to them. What I've handed out are a couple things. So there are evaluation forms. If you can, before you leave today, just take a couple minutes to fill those out. And you can return them back up here before you leave in just a file. That just helps us get some feedback about the seminar and any suggestions for future seminars as well. Also, if you are a provider and you want continuing education credit, there are CE certification forms up here. This does count towards the veteran requirement, so keep that in mind. So you can grab one on your way out. There's also a signage floating around somewhere, so if you haven't signed it, make sure that you do that before you leave today. So I am happy to introduce our speaker today, Phillip West, who is an alumnus of the MSW program at WVU. So we're excited about that. He got his MSW in 2014. Is that right? Yep. He's also a behavioral health therapist over at, or a behavioral health clinician over at the behavioral medicine Chestnut Ridge, and he's also a veteran. And has a unique perspective on today's topic. So we're very excited to have him. This is his second Lunch and Learn, so he was here last year as well. So we're excited to have him back, and I am going to hand it over to him. One quick thing before I get started. Last week we had some issues with the audio on the Zoom. So if I interrupt halfway through that, because I'm going to be kind of monitoring the chat, because that's how they kind of let us know if they're losing audio. So for you folks on Zoom, if you start to lose audio, please chime in through the chat feature. I'll try to make sure to monitor it, and we'll try to get that fixed. So if we have to stop halfway through, that's why. I don't know why it happens. I'm hoping it won't happen this time, but we'll try to keep it. That's what that's about. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Phillip, and I'm excited to hear your presentation.
Hi. So who is in the who's here? Students, providers?
I work here at WVU, but I'm not really a practicing therapist anymore. But
Okay. Gotcha. Students. Okay. All right. So like Dr. LeClue said, so I'm a clinical therapist in the Department of Behavioral Medicine and Psychiatry at WVU. I work at Lakewood Center, which is out in Cheat Lake. There are 3 full-time providers out there, so we're very small. But we are very busy. We do a lot of medication-assisted treatment. So we have a lot of clients who are on Suboxone. But then we also carry our own individual caseloads. And part of my interest in being a veteran is doing a lot with veterans for trauma. So today we'll talk about military sexual trauma. And I chose the title of the Unsung trauma because when we think about veterans, we think of like a lot of medals on their chests and purple hearts and combat action badges and things that just dangle around when they're walking or shine really bright when they're on the parade field. There are no awards for this type of trauma. And this type of trauma is very different. So even if somebody who's never been in combat has experienced sexual trauma, they still qualify for services through the Vet Center, which is specifically for combat veterans. Whereas somebody like myself who is non-active duty, non-combat, I don't qualify for services there. So even if they experienced sexual trauma during basic training, they would still qualify for services. But we'll get more into kind of the way the VA does it. To the best of my understanding, as not a VA. So if there are any VA employees, sorry if I get it wrong. So objective, we're going to look at what military sexual trauma is. I'll try not to bore too much with statistical information, but it's important to look at some things that can be done to help folks who've had an MST experience, and then the resources through the VA. So just like with most things in the federal government, there's a U.S. code specifically outlines what it is. So it's a psychological trauma resulting from physical assault of a sexual nature, battery of sexual nature, sexual harassment which occurred while the veteran was serving on active duty training, or inactive duty training. A lot of fancy words for what your order type was. So National Guard can be activated for active duty training, or even inactive duty training for like drills or things like that. Then sexual harassment is different. It's defined as repeated, unsolicited verbal or physical contact of a sexual nature. I did mean to start before I got into this. Anytime we're talking about specific sexual trauma, sometimes it might, even if we've not had our own experience, but maybe we work with a lot of folks who have that experience, it can sometimes bring some things up inside of us. So what I would recommend to anybody tonight that finds themselves kind of like uneasy a little bit, this is something I have to do a lot with doing a lot of trauma work, is really practicing self-care tonight. Whether you do yoga or mindfulness or exercise or different things. So just really kind of listen to your own bodies, and maybe ask our clients to listen to theirs, and make sure you take care of yourself. So looking a little bit further at military sexual trauma. So again, it's forced or coerced sexual encounters, inappropriate sexual jokes or lewd remarks, unwanted physical contact, repeated sexual advances or offers of something in exchange for sexual favors. And this counts onto social media. So it's not just saying something to somebody face to face, but it might be even leaving an inappropriate comment on somebody's Facebook picture. That might be well-intentioned, like, oh, hey, you look really pretty. But if then we're getting into perception. If that is an unsolicited comment, then it's not appropriate. So it's always one of those things where you've got to be really careful to not cross the line. So the common symptoms following MST. These are very similar to some of the things related to trauma, depression, anxiety. So disturbing memories or nightmares, difficulty feeling safe, depression, numbness, increase in substances, isolation, problems with anger, issues with sleep, but then also the physical health problems. Looking a little bit deeper, we're gonna kind of look a little bit at each of these, including the PTSD and psychological difficulty with relationships, substance use, physical health, and additional medical problems. Anytime we look at statistics, we have to remember that the numbers are not always 100% saying what we want them, what they should say in reflection, because if we think about the military makeup, there are so many men who serve in uniform and not as many women. And so the numbers look like they happen a whole lot more one way versus the other. And so try and keep that in mind too when we're looking at some of this information. MST survivors show a higher rate of developing post-traumatic stress disorder, men at 65% and women at 49.5%. And then according to data through the VA, other common diagnoses, depression, mood disorders, substance use disorders, and that'll be something that kind of pops up throughout. Difficulty with relationships and social functioning, so things like trust. Difficulty engaging in social activities, even sexual dysfunction. May experience guilt, shame, or anger. And they may have difficulty finding or maintaining work after their military service. So even if adjustment's not hard enough following military service, because no one really cares how fast you can take an M4 apart or how accurate you are 300 yards away. Not really a skill set in the civilian world. They don't need to know or care that somebody might be an expert marksman. So adjustment is hard enough, and then you add in trusting relationship with somebody, which is something we encounter with any trauma survivor. Physical health problems. So again, sexual difficulties, chronic pain, weight or eating problems, GI problems. One of the cases that tend to come to my mind the most is somebody who spent a lot of money and time investing into specialists outside of psychiatry because there was difficulty ambulating. And some doctor at Pittsburgh walked in and said, "You're fine, but you do need to see a psychiatrist, and you need to see a therapist, and we recommend a trauma therapist." And it turned out that there was a lot of repressed trauma memories that they carried in their legs and their muscles. MST survivors may also experience difficulty with attention, concentration, and memory, and increase in daydreaming. So things that could mimic other mental health diagnoses, but if we really start digging deeper, it's probably not ADHD, or it's probably not bipolar disorder. In substance use, it's 10 times higher for those who experience sexual assault. Again, we want to think about military culture. If anyone has served in the military, it's very common that drinking is involved. I was training for Kuwait at one point, and for 3 weeks, and a really hard training, and then there was a giant tent party at the end to celebrate. Because it's just part of the culture, and it is getting better. I like to think it's getting better because of the consequences that are associated if you're caught driving under the influence. But substance use is much higher. Physical health, obesity, weight loss, chronic pulmonary disease, liver disease, hypothyroidism. When we think about weight issues, we look over at mental health and there's eating disorder. One thing we'll talk about a little bit later is dissociative disorders. And with that, when somebody can no longer dissociate on their own, they will use substances to help them dissociate. So an increase in substance use, an increase in eating disorder. So if they're eating too much, they're not eating enough, they're either causing pain or they're causing themselves to leave psychologically. Mental health, bipolar, schizophrenia, eating disorders, and again, military sexual trauma is not a diagnosis. Raise your hand if you're surprised. No? Okay, good. So claims that are related to MST, they have to be filed under the actual mental health and physical health diagnosis. So if somebody who suffers with MST, it might be listed under their claims as PTSD, MST. So it's not saying that they didn't have MST, it's just not a diagnosis for everybody. Looking at specifically females and males with mental health diagnoses, again, these are skewed a little bit just because I think because of the number of male service members versus female service members. Males tend to have just recently, females have been allowed to be in more combat roles like infantry, rangers, things like that. So females, PTSD, dissociative disorders, eating disorders, and personality disorders. And males, you're looking at dissociative disorders and personality disorders. So I like dissociative disorders. Dissociative reactions is a huge part of trauma, and it's a huge part of really getting to know the patient, getting to know the client. So learning how to really assess for their dissociative disorders or their dissociative reactions, learning more about flashbacks and what we can do to help with it, can really benefit veterans. And a lot of times, it's too. I think it's we might feel that we're crazy because we're experiencing dissociation. It does not mean, if you've seen the movie Split, it does not mean you have a Patricia inside. It also does not mean you have the beast, right? Sometimes it just means that we're an outside observer looking down as if the situation is happening to somebody else. So chances are when the trauma took place, they left their body. Because the brain is a very good coping strategy that will protect us at all costs. And so chances are they were looking down as if the assault was happening to somebody else. So they found out that, hey, that's a really good coping strategy. So when those flashbacks come back, or those nightmares, or those other yucky feelings come back, then that's where the brain goes. But then what happens when the brain can no longer go there on their own? Substances are introduced, food disorder, eating's introduced, other unhealthy coping strategies, including cutting or burning or hair pulling, can be introduced. The military culture in sexual assault. This is the biggest area of difference between MST and other sexual assault. So when we think about MST, perpetrators are often other military service members. So that makes it really difficult because in the sexual assault survivor must continue to live and work with the same state. The very first MST case I worked was actually when I was a grad student. And I remember the veteran telling me that they were still stationed with the folks that assaulted them. And they had to see them every day, and they had to do their duty assignments with them every day. And it's exposure after exposure after exposure. encouraged to keep silent. Their reports may be ignored or be blamed by others for the assault. So it's your fault that happened because you had one too many drinks that night. It happens in the military too. Is it fair? No. Is it crappy? Yeah. But it happens, unfortunately, in lots of places. When I was in the service, my battle buddy was a female. She was a little bit older than me. But we just really kind of clicked. I was a driver, and so she was my A driver. So we'd go on long missions. She would be in the truck with me. But it was never this kind of like fear. It was always this, we openly communicated. Her now husband was deployed to Iraq and had a heart attack while he was overseas. And so she got that dreaded phone call that, you know, your fiance at the time, very sick, and he's being flighted to Germany. Never a good sign. And so she called her family, and then I was the next phone call, and she drove from where she was living to where I was living at the time because she needed somebody that she could trust. Never once was there a fear introduced within that battle buddy relationship the Army calls it. It was always, I have your six, you have my six. When you're driving 1,000 miles in one day, I'll keep you awake. Cool. If we're downrange, I'm going to have your back, and you're going to have my back. She's actually getting ready to deploy now, and that little part of me is like, I should probably be there with her. But I'm not. So then looking for this at this statistic, I'll try not to bore you. Annual incident of experienced sexual assault is 3% among active duty women and 1% among active duty men. Again, don't focus too much on the percentages. It just kind of paints an idea. Sexual coercion and unwanted sexual attention occur at a rate of 8% and 27% among women and 1 and 5% among men. 20 to 43%, pretty large range. Of female service members and veterans have reported an MST experience, and then 1 to 3% of male service members have reported an MST experience.
You might get into this later on if you do that time. Is it often just general people like of any rank, or could it be, is it people of power?
Not always.
Not always.
Yeah, it's not always people of power. It can be, just like in this, almost think of it like the civilian world too. It could be somebody in power, like if you do this, then I'll promote you. Because maybe you're second in line for the promotion, not first. But I'll find a reason to not promote the other person if, but that if usually doesn't end up happening. But it could also be something like 2 specialists out, and then something ends up happening. So again, this is kind of that caveat. Percentages are skewed due to overall numbers of male veterans and female veterans. The researchers suggest maybe there's only about a 1% difference when you're really looking at the data. And then they suggest providing care for victims of sexual harassment and assault is as an important issue within the VA for male as well as female patients. We'll get into this a little bit more, but the VA does assess for MST for all patients. And it's something that I think would be appropriate if we carried over to the civilian world too, if we could just figure out ways to ask it. Unlike when you go to your primary care physician, you safe at home? Any abuse? Because I'm going to answer yes to that. So what happens first? So this is how they report it. There are 2 different reporting strategies. So the service member contacts the sexual assault response coordinator, the SAP or victim advocate or healthcare personnel. And then the SLARC notifies the assigned victim advocate. Victim advocate provides non-clinical treatment. So crisis intervention, explanation of reporting options, available resources. And the 2 options are unrestricted and restricted. So in an unrestricted report, the service member contacts the investigative services, and then the sexual assault response coordinator is notified and assigned to victim advocate. Victim advocate provides crisis intervention on sports, so that's similar to what we just saw what happens first. Mental health and medical care, and then a SAFE exam is done. So SAFE exams are the sexual assault forensic exams, so they're starting to gather evidence at that time. Legal services gets involved. Victim advocate provides ongoing medical treatment. And then the victim receives updates on case status from the commander. So then the commander knows that this happened, which can cause some tension among military ranks. Then there's a restricted report on the mental health and medical care, safe exams all done, legal services still contacted. The SART continues to, it reports non-personally identifying information to the commander. So then the commander knows an assault happened, but it doesn't know who. They don't know who. And then the victim advocate continues providing non-clinical support, but at any time, the victim's able to transition from a restricted report to a non-restricted report. These are available resources. They're really similar to what we offer at Ruby or any other hospital. There's confidential helplines. Those are there just in case you ever come across somebody who discloses they have MST and it's never been reported. There's advocacy, medical treatment, mental health, counselors, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists. The military has them all. Even within the Guard, there's physician's assistants. Don't know if West Virginia has a psychiatrist on staff or not, but there are counselors and social workers that are civilian and in uniform. There's chaplains, and then there's legal assistants as well. Active duty bases tend to have all of these on site. The National Guard, they're stationed out of, for the Army, they're stationed out of Charleston. So they can travel if needed, but then there's counselors that are located. There's one here in Morgantown, this is a counselor that's stationed out of the Morgantown Readiness Center. And then there are different armories around the state. The therapeutic assistant, this is where it's not any different from any other sexual trauma or any other trauma. So there's crisis stabilization and psychiatric hospitalization. The VA does offer some really neat program. It's a 28-day program, I think, either 1 month or 2 months. Long-term residential treatment for PTSD. They also do their 28-day substance use treatment. Outpatient services, med management, group therapy, individual therapy. I don't spend a lot of time talking about evidence-based treatments. You guys are getting that a lot in school. So these are some of the these are the ones that I tend to use more often. Cognitive processing therapy and EMDR. You can get specialty training outside of graduate school. So cognitive processing therapy is a cognitive restructuring treatment. So it's taking that veteran who was on an operation over in the Middle East, and they get their report from military intelligence. You should have no resistance. Nothing's reported. And then they get on the mission, and they're driving, and people die. Now that convoy commander is not blaming themselves that people died. It's my fault that we hit that IED. We would use something like cognitive processing therapy to help them realize that only one person knew that IED was planted. And it wasn't military intelligence. It's kind of like Microsoft works. They don't get it right all the time. But they get it right a lot of the time. And it was the enemy. We get them to start realizing that not every time we're going to get that. Psychodynamic therapy, I'm working on this a little bit with my clinical supervisor even now because he's an analyst. And so it's really kind of interesting in helping build the trauma narrative from an analytic standpoint or a dynamic standpoint. Cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, you guys know a lot about that? So EMDR uses what's called bilateral stimulation. One of the things I like about it is really get out of the way as a therapist. So you're not asking, tell me more about that. Why? I know, that's fine. But, so we're really getting out of the way and we're asking them to just go with that. Whatever thought comes to their mind during the bilateral stimulation, just go with that. Can you tell me more? And then you add bilateral stimulation. And then once it stops, they come back. And so the only thing we're really monitoring is their output. We might do a little bit of Socratic dialogue, but we're really staying out of the way of building the narrative. So there might be this thought, which then leads to this thought, and then it goes back to this thought, and then it goes over here, but it comes back, and then it really kind of forms this chain that can be really fascinating to watch unfold. And then there's prolonged exposure therapy. I only use this when I have to. I'm not a huge fan of asking somebody to expose themselves over and over again. I use it for court. So if somebody comes to me and they say, I have to testify about my assault. We don't have time to really do EMDR. We don't have time to do cognitive processing therapy. We don't have time to use the instinctual trauma response. I'm going to use those next 3 weeks to get them to get through their narrative for court. And then once court's over, we bring the emotions back. We really work on telling the narrative and staying grounded and in the person for testing.
Quick question about the slide before, the 28-day programs.
Uh-huh.
Do they offer for the substance abuse? Do they offer like the concurrent substance abuse and trauma treatment?
I think
do
so.
they do them
I think that's how it's set up.
Like the
Been since
integrated.
grad school, since I worked down there. I'm pretty sure it's both, and then they have a standalone recovery program.
Just curious.
So some of the available resources. So positive MS screening result in free of charge treatment for anything that's related to the MST. So physical injuries, illness, psychological conditions, regardless of copay or eligibility status. All veterans are screened by these 2 questions. At least these are the 2 questions that I found published. Could be a little bit more in depth, but these are what I found. Did you receive uninvited and unwanted sexual attention, such as touching, cornering, pressure for sexual favors, or vocal remarks? Yes or no? Did someone ever use force or threat of force to have sexual contact with you against your will? Yes or no? If you answered yes to one of those, then you are positive for MST, and at that point you would be put in contact with like the MST coordinator, where they would explain the next steps for you. And then there's MST coordinators at every VA regional office, so if they need to travel, they would travel. So, of course, it's really simple to file claims through the federal government, especially the VA. Right? Unfortunately, there's a lot of paperwork involved. If it was filed and reported while in service, it is a little bit easier because hopefully the paperwork's already in. So if you filed while in service, you need the DoD sexual assault report forms, and then the investigative reports completed during military service. If you did not file while in service, the list is much longer. The VA starts looking for markers in that. So records from official sources, pregnancy tests, STDs, statements from others, including roommates, other service members, requested transfer to another duty assignment. So among active duty, I believe it's about every 3 years you transfer duty assignments unless you're able to stay. So it might be that year and you're requesting transfer. Because that could be a red flag. Decrease in work performance. So you are a PT stud who maxes it out every time with a 300. Now it's changing to like 600. And then suddenly you fail. That's a red flag. Because now you're not taking care of yourself, you're not working out, you're not doing those things. So with PT, it used to be push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run for the Army. And so now maybe you failed the push-ups, the sit-ups, and the run, but you got 100 last time, 6 months ago. That would be a pretty drastic change. So decrease in performance. Increasing substance use. In the military, a lot of times they're even assessing for caffeine. So prior to deployment, what's your smoking like? What's your caffeine intake? Since you found out you're deploying, what's your smoking and caffeine intake? Because that can raise red flags to how you're going to respond to stress following. Episodes of the following without clear cause: depression, panic attacks, anxiety, unexplained behavior, relationship issues like divorce, and again, sexual dysfunction. So these are just some of the references that have been published that I use: DAB, Department of Veteran Affairs, Making the Connection, MST and Men, Veterans Health Administration and MST, Sexual Assault Response, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. Unfortunately, a lot of the data through the VA, and this is one of the comments I get a lot in these presentations, a lot of the data is, there's not a ton to get as a civilian. That doesn't work for the DoD. So unless you can find articles published by VA folks, it's really hard to get specific data. I tried by reaching out to friends I had that work at the VA, and I was done that, even for lectures. Working with sexual traumas is very tough. It's very, very debilitating to us as the clinicians if we don't take care of ourselves. One of the veterans I have in my caseload now is an MST survivor. And they refuse to disclose what they disclosed to me to the VA because they're afraid they're going to lose their VA benefits. So this individual has the 100% service connected. So they make roughly $3,200 a month tax-free. And they can work, so it's different than normal disability. They are afraid if they disclose to me what happened in their child, if they disclose to them what they disclose to me, so we're talking a lot about their childhood trauma, then they're afraid that they'll lose their benefits. So I've reached out to the VA with them in my office to let them know, hey, you can talk to them about this. But it's just this idea that they can't get past the stigma associated to non-combat related, non-military related stuff. A lot of folks in talking with one of my friends who works at the VA that does a lot of MST therapy, a lot of the individuals that she's noticed and just observation, they have substantial childhood traumas. A lot of times they will enter the military to try and get away, to try and make a difference in themselves and their family, to break cycles. And then for something like this to happen with somebody that is supposed to have their six, it can crush them. And it takes a lot of time to then build trust, to build any kind of therapeutic alliance with them. When they've been through the gamut that unfortunately a lot of sexual assault survivors have to go through. They're treated as a criminal, unfortunately at times, by somebody who might not be informed. Or they have to be traumatized again by going through a safety. And so really learning how to meet folks with a lot of empathy, a lot of love, and a lot of compassion is really important. Having a warm, inviting office, having a really trauma-informed clinic, so if I'm like, hey, you guys need to keep it down. Cut it down. Because maybe they can't deal with the door slamming open and shut. So it's not just with us as the providers, but it's with everybody that we come in contact with. Everybody that they come in contact with through the office. So I hope that kind of makes sense too. But and Dr. LeClue and I were talking about this before. I do a lot of things that I say to you all that you shouldn't do. I have a lot of trauma patients back to back. It's very exhausting. It makes for very long 8 hours. But it's really learning how to take care of ourselves and doing trauma therapy, doing work with sexual assault survivors. So it's finding ways now while you're in school and you might be feeling slightly overwhelmed with, I've got tests and I've got papers and I have internships and I have home life and I have football on Saturday. Because we live in Morgantown, we can't forget football on Saturday. I have all these things that I want to do and that I need to do. How do I find balance? But what I'll suggest to you is if you can find it now as students, it'll be that much easier in your professional career. Because it's really important to self-care. We can't regulate our emotions. How can we ask the person sitting across from us to regulate theirs? And sometimes they'll put us in check. I had one yesterday that sat down, you look stressed. Well, we're human. Sometimes, we're never perfect. So we use that as a teachable moment. that sometimes things come up in our lives, or we might be dealing with things, and now we turn it back over to them. So that was a little short, sorry. Talked a little fast. I hope you guys have questions.